Same as yesterday.
Give the answers to the oral examination.
Okay, I've been teaching long enough to learn that anytime there's a lull, then I start. So it doesn't matter if we're on time or not. Let me just mention where we're going to go in this talk. And what we want to do is integrate this discussion of the theory of interest into our previous discussion on yesterday on the theory of price. So again, one of the advantages of the Austrian approach is that everything is integrated from the foundation, right? It all builds on this realistic foundation of the human persons and human condition of action and so on. So yesterday, when we talked about price theory, we left two issues untouched. And one of these issues you heard a talk on by Dr. Engelhardt yesterday, and this was on money. So we didn't make any attempt in talking about price theory to talk about the price of money. One of the great achievements of Ludwig von Mises, the very first book that he wrote and published in 1912, Theory of Money and Credit, he showed how to apply this approach of preferences and demand and supply to money to also explain the price of money, the purchasing power of money. So that gap has been filled, hopefully, already, which leaves us with one other issue that we did not address in talking about price theory yet, and this is the element of time. So all we talked about on Monday and all that Dr. Engelhardt talked about with money on Monday is what in finance we might call the spot price of goods. The actual cash exchange prices here and now in markets. That's what we talked about. But most of you know that in addition to spot prices for goods, there are also forward prices. And then there are derivative markets, right? Futures and options and swaps that derive from the forward price. And the forward price then introduces us to the temporal aspect of action. And so that we haven't yet discussed, and so we want to broach that topic in this in this talk, and then integrate again this discussion of time, and then interest, of course, refers to the intertemporal dimension of things, prices. We want to integrate this with our price theory. Now, we'll proceed in 3 steps. First, we just want to talk, as we did on Monday, just about fundamentals. It's about remember we talked about the fundamentals of human action as purposeful behavior, and we concentrated on the finite nature of the human person. Right? So we have ends, but our means are limited. We're finite beings. We can't just will our ends to be attained. We make this distinction between ends and means, and then we design action by employing the means to attain the ends. And when we do this, the satisfaction of our ends is typically not perfect and only temporary. And then we have to act some more, right? We have to act again and value and so on. So action continues on in our lives. In this talk, now we want to concentrate on another fundamental character of the human person, that human persons are temporal. We're finite temporal beings. We exist in time, right? So we can also imagine infinite, eternal beings right? Who wouldn't engage in human action the way we do. So we're temporal, and this is what we want to concentrate on. So let's again talk about what is fundamental then about our existence in time as human beings. And then we'll talk about the second step, the 2 valuations that we make with respect to time. And then the third thing we'll do is talk about the theory of interest. So that comes in natural sequence. Okay, so here are some of the basic principles of time. The first thing we want to highlight is that the time at which we make a decision to act and the realization of our end are never synchronous. The realization of our end at the moment we decide to act is always in the future to us. So there's never a synchronous character in time of those 2 things. It follows, this was the one point that we made about temporal existence on Monday. It follows that when we make a valuation about one end being suitable for us to pursue in action, we can only anticipate the value of the realization of that end at the moment that we're deciding to act. It's only an anticipation. Notice we stress this because all of the important principles of entrepreneurship and profit and loss and so on, all of these important features of human life stem from that fact. Those of you who are familiar with neoclassical economics know that in neoclassical economics, they don't have this realistic human element of time. When they put time into their models, it's just like a time to the physicists. It's just a variable, right? Over which something is moving, or action, markets are moving or something. It's just a placeholder, so to speak. It's just click, 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 time passes. But for us as human beings, time is much more robust. It has meaning to us, a very important meaning that, again, if our theory doesn't incorporate, we don't have a very robust theory. We sort of reduced it to certain elements that aren't faults on the face of it, but aren't very helpful in understanding human action. And so that's where we begin. Now, my definitions here of these concepts, I'm just following Mises and human action. So if you've read human action, you've seen these definitions. Mises says one fundamental aspect of time for us as persons engaged in action is the period of production. The reason this is important, the period of production, is it's a choice variable. We can decide between different production processes that take more or less time. And therefore the period of what he calls the working time, the stages of production. Let's say you want to build an automobile and you start by mining iron out of the ground and then shipping the iron to a steel mill and then making steel, and then in another step of production you form body panels for the car, and then in the final step of production you have an assembly factory where all the parts of the car are put together. So there's a certain time structure to this production. There's working time involved, right? And we could imagine that each production process we could arrange in a technological way that would either lengthen out the time of production or shrink it. So there are various automobile production processes that are more hand and labor intensive and less capital intensive. And they typically take a longer period of time. It's a choice variable for us, and so it's relevant, the working time. And then there could be also maturing time. There could be the time between the end of the production, the physical production of the thing, and then the beginning of consumption. So the classic case of this would be wine production. So you grow the grapes, right, and then you harvest, and you make the wine, and then it sits. As a physical good, you're done with production, so to speak. I mean, you're done putting inputs into production, but you have this maturing time. The same thing could happen, by the way, with automobiles. The automobiles are produced, they're shipped to a dealer, they sit on the dealer lot. There's a marketing period, right? There's a maturing period where you're trying to find a synergy between the consumers and what you produced. So this is always involved in action as well. And then there's the duration of serviceableness of the good that's been produced. There's the durability of the good that's been produced. And again, the reason this is important for us as human beings is because we can choose. We can make cars that are more durable, and we can make cars that are less durable. And the production process for a less durable car might be cheaper. The resource use, the opportunity cost might be lower. And so we might have a market for that with people whose wealth is not as great, right? The middle class. And then for the rich, we might make cars that are much more durable and feature-laden and so on and so forth. This is a choice variable. And so it's relevant for our action to think. We have to think about our production of things with respect to these elements. There's also the period of provision. The period of provision is a planning horizon. It's the time horizon over which we plan action. And again, this is a choice variable for us. Right? So we could think out, like some of you are thinking about going to grad school, and so you're planning out, right, 4 years, or maybe it's going to be 5, or you're thinking about what the career paths are beyond that, and you're planning out over decades, maybe even those of you who have small children, you've come to the realization you can plan for things after you're dead. Right? We can have intentions to accomplish certain ends in other people's lives after we've left this world. So this is important to us, right? It's relevant, and therefore it's a praxeological concept. It's an important logical feature of action. And then we get to the point that is most important for interest theory, which is this distinction that we make between sooner and later. Now here again, I'll rely on Mises's phraseology. He can't really improve on his genius in these respects. So he says this, he says, time, as we experience time as human beings, time is an irreversible flux. So you have to love that phrase, right? An irreversible flux. And what he's trying to get across, and once you hear that, of course, it should ring a bell with you. But what he's trying to point out is that time is not like means. It's not like labor or let's say, capital funding or land or something, where we can accumulate a bunch of it and then expend it all at once on an action. That's not, time isn't like that. We don't like accumulate 100 days and then expend it all at once in a single action. Time is an irreversible flux. It just marches on, right? And therefore, we can't allocate time like a means. It isn't a means. It's something in which our action is taking place, but it's not a means to us. And so the relevant concept, as Mises goes on to say, is between sooner in time and later in time. The reason this is relevant to us is because, again, it's a choice variable. We can choose to take an action sooner in time, or we can take the action later in time. How will we choose between taking it sooner and taking it later? We'll choose according to the way that we value those alternatives. And this is what we would call economizing an action with respect to time. We economize our action with respect to time by choosing when to take the action. So for several different actions, when we take it matters for the value that accrues to us when we act. Just to give you a mundane example of this, well, it's mundane to you, it's actually quite important to me. Sublime, I might add. My wife and I have our wedding anniversary on November 17th. Now, I'm not going to go to her tomorrow and say, honey, let's celebrate our wedding anniversary. You know, that would just be like, now, of course, you might be married to someone where they would think that highly romantic, and it would be, but the point is it changes the value of it. When we take the action, we'll change the value of it, even if our action is exactly the same, even if we plan exactly the same event. Right? And so the timing of our action matters to us. It's a choice variable, again. And this is one of the ways in which we value with respect to time. Okay, so let's turn to that question. The question, I'll put it this way, the timing of an action. So as we said already, the value of a good or an action with a good can vary at different moments in time. And because it can vary at different moments in time, we'll take account of that. It doesn't mean we'll always take the action at the moment at which its value seems to be the greatest, because that might involve cost, ancillary costs, right? And so the net benefit may not be as great. But we'll take account of it, that's the point. We'll incorporate it into our decision, this element of different value that can accrue to a good. Now here we're speaking about consumer and producer goods. So a consumption good, like a dozen roses that I might give to my wife for our anniversary, a consumption good like that can vary in value depending on when I deliver the roses. Or to take an economic example, we could think about the oil market. So when oil is supplied on the market and bought and sold on the market, its price might be different. The price of oil in the spot market today might be $70 a barrel, but it might be that the forward price in 6 months is 100, or it could be 50, or it could, right? And so obviously, if you have these differences in value at different moments in time, the economizing thing to do is to move the supply of the good to where its value is higher, where its price is higher. And so that's what would happen. Speculators would be doing this in the market. This is where forward prices and derivatives come from. So just like with any other arbitraging activity, where we take a good from where it's lower valued and supply it to where it's higher valued, anytime we do this kind of, people are engaged in this kind of activity, the marginal value of the good will come together. So if it were true that the forward price of oil was $100 6 months forward, and the spot price today was 70, that difference wouldn't last very long, because the producers of oil today would simply withdraw the supply and hold on to it, and then supply it with the anticipation of supplying it 6 months forward. Or a speculator would buy it today if the entrepreneurs are too dull to see this, and then hold it off the market and supply it in the future. But the very act of doing this, of reducing the supply in the present and increasing it in the future, brings the prices together. And that's how we know that allocation has been economized, that a profit has been earned. So here the timing of action is no different in that sense than all of the pricing activity that we talked about again on Monday, or the other discussions that you've had already about production and allocation. Okay, so let me, for those of you who aren't up to speed on this, let me just give you a definition of a forward price. So some of you may have never heard of this before. A forward price is when two parties today make an agreement to exchange a good at a stipulated date in the future at a price they agree upon today. So the 6 month forward price for oil, we have traders today saying, getting together and saying, I'll sell you oil at $100 a barrel 6 months from now. And the other guy says, yes, I agree to that trade. Now, obviously, just like any other trade, that trade would only be mutually beneficial if the two parties have different preferences. Right? They must think differently about how the future is going to work out. So the one person who's selling the oil at $100 a barrel in this forward contract 6 months from today, thinks that the actual price is, that's a better price than the actual spot price will be 6 months from today. But the person buying at $100 a barrel thinks that's cheap, right, compared to what the spot price will be 6 months from today. They have, as we say, reverse preferences, and so they can make a mutually advantageous trade. And so this is where we get forward prices. And we mentioned already then the efficient temporal allocation of goods. So this is the first way in which we value our actions with respect to time. And the second way is what we call in economic analysis time preference. And as I alluded to already, this refers to the distinction between sooner and later. Now, in order to tease out this principle, just like we did with the laws of utility on Monday, we have to make a ceteris paribus assumption. We have to stipulate something, right? So remember when we did this on Monday and we talked about the laws of utility, we said, suppose we have Caruso and he chooses a unit of coconut consumption of 2 coconuts, and then he has different ends to which he can put 2 coconut unit of size. He can drink the coconuts, or he would also use 2 coconuts to eat the coconut meat, and so on and so forth. These are stipulations, right? That isn't always true in action, that units are like this, or that people choose in this way. But hopefully you can see right away that in markets, units actually do come in equally serviceable amounts. A gallon of gasoline, 87 octane, same as every other. A gallon or a barrel of oil of a particular grade, same as every other barrel of oil, and so on and so forth. So this, it's a realistic stipulation that applies in the real world. And so we could do the same thing, or we're doing the same thing, when we talk about time preference. Time preference is the preference a person has for a given satisfaction sooner as opposed to the same satisfaction later. This again is a ceteris paribus deduction that we make from the distinction between sooner and later. By the way, hopefully you can see that that just is, well, when I say this, it just rings true to you. Just like when I say the second law of utility. The second law of utility is that more of a good is preferred to less. Hopefully when I say that, it's just, yeah, okay, I see that. A good is scarce, right? So more of it has to be preferred to less because I can accomplish more with more of the good than I can with less of the good. So that has to be true, right? It has to follow out logically. Hopefully it seems just as obvious to you that the sooner satisfaction of a given end is preferred to a later satisfaction of the same amount, right, or the same character, however you want to stipulate this. It just seems so. But for those of you who are somewhat skeptical of this, let me provide you then with the logical implications. Mises again rehearses these in Human Action. The logical implications if we assume that that's not true. What if we assume that people always prefer a future satisfaction, a later satisfaction, to a sooner or present satisfaction? Well, hopefully you can see right away that if that were true, then a person would never consume. Because right now they prefer to consume, and get this satisfaction in the future, but when that future moment arrives, they'll also still prefer the future, right? That seems problematic. We know that people in fact do act. The other logical alternative would be, what if we don't care between sooner and later? What if we have no preference? What if we treat them equally? Then what follows from that? Well, as Mises points out, what follows from that is, because we prefer more of a good to less, if we didn't have a preference for sooner over later, then we would start right now on the longest, most productive production processes we can technologically imagine. We'd forego any shorter production processes that weren't more productive and engage only in the longest ones possible. But this, again, is precisely the opposite of what we do. What we actually do is we engage in the shortest, most productive production processes first, and then exhaust those, and then we go to the longer, more productive production processes, right? So you can imagine, again, a kind of stylistic example of this. You have Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden, and instead of just hunting and gathering and doing these primitive sorts of production processes, they hit upon the notion of building a framed house. they can conceive, of knocking down trees and cutting them up and so on and so forth. So they have to build saws first and so on. And so they set upon those production processes because that would be so much more valuable to them than just, grubbing on the ground and sleeping under the stars and in the rain and snow and so on. No, of course they don't do this. They set upon the shortest, most productive production processes, just again like we do today. So this is the idea that Mises has in mind here. Okay, let me also mention that just like preference, time preference cannot be shown false by examples. Again, Mises takes a few of these just to illustrate. But let me start with an example of preference, just to show you again that the logic, the power of the logic involved in this. And this is an example I give to my students at Grove City College. Suppose we have a person, and this would be a fairly common experience, I imagine, among younger people, not among people of my age, but, and it's something like this, you come across a person, you meet a person, and the person's smoking cigarettes. And as the person is smoking the cigarette, he's telling you how much he would love to kick this filthy habit. He hates smoking cigarettes. He wants to, he understands, this is terrible for my health in the long run, and, it's kind of annoying to other people, right? I'm doing this and then blowing the smoke, and they hate that, but I just can't stop, or whatever, excuse he gives to this. And then here's the question: does this guy prefer to smoke? And the answer that economists give is yes, indeed, he prefers to smoke. How do we know this? Or what do we mean when we say that he prefers to smoke? Because his preference is always consistent with his action. This idea of demonstrated preference, right? Preference is just that valuing choice that we make between what we value more highly and what we value less highly. We're just using the word this way, in other words. And so you can't say that, this guy who's smoking does not prefer to smoke, right? Then you're using preference in an ambiguous way. That's not the way economists use the word preference. And so the same sort of logic applies to time preference. It's very difficult to come up with counterexamples. Mises gives 3 possible counterexamples in human action. He says, suppose we have a guy who has a theater ticket for Friday night, and then he meets a friend, and his friend has a ticket to another theater production also for Friday night. And the guy who has the theater ticket says, I wish that ticket were for Saturday. See, I prefer the future good, right? I wish it was not a present good, but a future good. And as Mises points out, this is not a counter to time preference, right? This is just, again, the problem of scarcity. We can't do 2 actions synchronously because we're finite beings. And so they're mutually exclusive. We choose one over the other, right? And we always have to give up the one. The other case seems a little bit more difficult, but actually, again, it's quite easy to resolve logically. This is the famous example of ice in the winter and ice in the summer. So we have a person who, in the winter, says, I prefer ice in the summer. But you see, again, Ceteris is not paribus here, right? The stipulation doesn't hold. You're not getting the same satisfaction in the present as compared to the future, because having ice in the summer allows you to do all sorts of more enjoyable things that you wouldn't dare do in the winter, at least not in Pennsylvania. Sitting out on the veranda and sipping iced tea, right? Yeah, you can do that in the summer. So I prefer the ice in the summer. Of course I do, because the conditions under which I'm going to consume at that moment in time are more valuable. Hopefully this rings a bell. This is the timing of an action, right? Of course I want ice in the summer because I can do things with it that are much more beneficial than I can do with ice in the winter. And this is not a violation of time preference. And then the third case he gives is of the miser. So the miser, right, who just hoards money, it's a Scrooge McDuck, right? He hoards up all his coins and swims in them in his vault or whatever, and never expends. And as Mises points out, well, yeah, the miser has very low time preference, right? He doesn't do much consumption in the present. He saves most of his wealth, but he doesn't have zero time preference or whatever negative time preference would mean. He still has a preference for sooner. It's just that he has very, very low time preferences, as we say in economics. So again, these don't seem to be very effective counterexamples. So now, from these considerations, we'll move on then to the discussion of the rate of interest. And here, we're going to use this terminology. We're going to talk about what we'll call the pure rate of interest. And the pure rate of interest is the premium that people place because of their time preference on the present. So it's the premium that people place on the present or sooner as opposed to later, the future. This is how we define the pure rate of interest. Okay, so here's the schematic. Here's the logical schematic of how the argument runs out. And I've superimposed this with some of what we did on Monday. So again, to show you the integration of how we integrate interest theory into price theory. So this top line is what we talked about on Monday for consumer goods. We have preferences that people have. And then because the buyers and the sellers have reverse preference, they can both gain in trade. And so they, those who want the good more urgently demand it, and those who have it, who desire to keep it less urgently, supply it. And then the market clearing price for the consumer good emerges, so we get the price of the consumer good. It's exactly the same logical structure for time preference. We have people with different time preferences. Some, like the miser, have low time preference. And some have a very urgent present gratification that they want to satisfy. They have what we call high time preference. And so the high time preference person is willing to pay the low time preference person a premium at which they can both gain for the lending of the present money and then the payback in the future. And so this is the second line. And we call that interest rate the pure rate of interest because it depends on nothing but time preference. At the end of the talk, we'll get to the other factors that influence interest rates. But at this point, we want to talk just about time preference. And then the integration comes in the bottom part of the chart. And again, we talked a little bit about this on Monday. The prices of consumer goods generate revenue. So this is the marginal revenue product for the producer of the good. So whatever this consumer good is, let's say it's smartphones or whatever, the iPhone 10 that we used in our example on Monday, selling the price at which it's sold generates revenue for Apple. And so that's the marginal revenue. And then the product part, the marginal revenue product, the MRP, the product part is the physical production of the producer good. Remember, we used the example of a tech worker. So the tech worker has a certain physical productivity in the production process. With his team, he generates a certain physical product, a new innovative 3D feature on the phone or whatever. And then the consumers value that to a certain extent, and then that generates marginal revenue product. And then the interest rate gives us the discount. So that's the D part in DMRP. That comes from the interest rate. So the entrepreneur's demand for a factor of production, if he pays in advance, if he fronts the money to the worker, paying the worker, every month as you go along, but the worker is producing something that's not going to be sold until next year, well, then the entrepreneur has to earn interest on that loan, right? On that implicit loan that he's making. And so he discounts the wage. He's only willing to pay the marginal revenue product discounted by the rate of interest because he could take his funds that he's saved up in the past and just lend them out on credit markets and earn the rate of interest. He doesn't have to engage in production to earn a rate of return. He can earn this in the credit markets. And then there's the opportunity cost of the worker, right? And these two factors then determine the price of producer goods. So again, this fills a gap that we left on Monday. Okay, so now the next step, we want to look at these arrows, just like we did again on Monday for the top line. We want to look at the causal arrows. How do preferences lead to demand and supply for present money? How does the demand and supply for present money lead to the interest rate? Now, one very important, this is critical, and there's a lot of discussion about this in the literature. For those of you who are in the graduate seminar that I'll do on Thursday, we'll talk quite a bit about this point, but here I just want to introduce it so you're aware of it. So here's again the definition of the pure rate of interest. It's the premium on the present, or we could say the discount to the future, as we just went through. But this comes about in the form of intertemporal trade of money. So money actually has two prices. It has a spot price, an exchange price right now, the purchasing power of money right now as we exchange it, and it has an intertemporal price. Present money is traded for future money. Goods also have two prices. They have a spot price, the price today, the cash price that you would pay to buy it today, and they have forward prices. You notice people do not make loans in kind. There are no loans in apples or in lug nuts or in machine parts or things of this sort. Because if you made a loan in goods, then when the future came, the actual market value of the good could be radically different depending upon the timing issue, right? Depending upon the demand and supply conditions, the timing. Its consumptive value or productive value could be wildly different. And so people don't do this. Instead, they make their intertemporal trades only in money. This is because money is the medium of exchange, the general medium of exchange. And so it's not subject to the vagaries of value from changing conditions of consumption and production. Every dollar always has an interchangeable value in the market with respect to its use as a medium of exchange. If I have $100 today, in cash, I'm perfectly happy to trade it for $100 somebody else has, right? 5 20s for 5 20s. But nobody would trade 6 20s for 5 20s today, right? They're perfectly interchangeable. Or as we say, the money is the unit of economic calculation. And economic calculation covers all possible configurations of calculating across persons, across places, across time. And so people naturally gravitate toward money when they make loans and not goods. So that's an important point. And again, a lot can be said, more can be said about this, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so here's how we go from preferences to demand for present money and supply of present money. So in the left-hand column, I've got one person who has these preferences. We're assuming, and again, we'll get to this at the very end, but we're assuming that the purchasing power of money does not change. So we'll get to that. What happens if it does? We'll get to that later. So $1,000 today is preferred over $1,000 in 1 year because of time preference. But there is some amount of money in 1 year that this person would be willing to accept in exchange for $1,000 today. And in my stipulation, it's $1,100. So if someone were to come along to this person and say, I'll pay you $1,100 if 1 year from today if you give me $1,000 today, those preferences say this person would take that trade. They would prefer that. Now, the person on the right-hand side, person B, places a much larger premium on the present. In order to bid away $1,000 from person B, someone would have to pay $300, right, a year from now. So we say person A has lower time preference. The premium person A requires is smaller or lower. And person B has higher time preference. He's much more urgent demand for the $1,000 in the present. So the two of them could then get together and make a mutually advantageous trade at any pure interest rate between 10% and 29%. Right? Person B would prefer to get the $1,200 today as opposed to, let's say, $1,000 today as opposed to $1,250, let's say, a year from today. So he'd be willing to pay $1,250 to person A. Person A ranks $1,250 up here. So person A is happy to get $1,250 a year from today and give up his $1,000 today. That's where the interest rate comes from, the pure rate of interest, right? just from this mutually advantageous trade. Just like the price of any good comes from the mutually advantageous trade when two persons have reverse preferences. Okay, so now what about the market? Well, we'll skip over the details of this because we covered this on Monday, right? So in a market, we've got a whole bunch of different people with a whole spectrum of preferences across all these people. And so when they meet in markets, they gravitate toward exchanging at the market clearing price so that all of their preferences will be satisfied, just like we had explained on Monday. And so here we call this the time market. This is all the trade of present money for future money. And then the interest rate is set by people or gravitates toward this point where all of the lenders can find a borrower and all of the borrowers can find a lender. That's the only rate at which this happens. Okay, so that's, again, ground that we covered already. Now, just to summarize this part, time preferences then determine both elements of the market. Just like preferences in general determine both the price of a good and the quantity of it traded, time preference determines both the market clearing rate of interest, the market rate of interest, and the amount of lending and borrowing that goes on. There's nothing except time preference behind these phenomena in the market of prices and quantities traded. Now, it is true that, and I didn't stress this on Monday, but it is true that economists, Austrian economists, recognize that preferences themselves are influenced by the circumstances in which we act. But there is no scientific relationship between the circumstances in which we act and the formulation of the valuations in our minds by which we choose one thing over another. We're just at a loss to know scientifically to give an account of this, right? And so that's why we start logically with preferences. But you shouldn't think that we're just stipulating that people have preferences. We're not saying that. We're saying that you have real people like you and me in real set of circumstances, and we go to the gas station today and we buy gasoline. That's what we're talking about. Or you go to a PNC bank and take out a student loan to enter college. It's that we're speaking about. You do that because your preferences are such and such within the circumstances of your own life. So to highlight that point. And then the last point on this slide that I'll make is that for the purpose of economic calculation that the entrepreneur is going to engage in, the time market allows the entrepreneur to have either present money or some amount of money in the future, that these two are made equivalent by being able to lend and borrow. And so in my simple example, the future money is calculated as the present money or present value times this term 1 plus the rate of interest. So if I have $1,000 and I lend it out on interest for a year at 25%, I'll have $1,250 at the end of a year. That of course is called compounding. But if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm investing $1,000 in a production process with the anticipation of getting $1,250 a year from today, I can know that those two sums are also equivalent, right? I can either have $1,000 today because of credit markets, or I can have $1,250 in a year. So if I'm producing and selling something a year from now, I know exactly what that future money is worth in the market as present money. And so the entrepreneur can now compare all of the future revenues that he's going to receive through production to present money that he's expending in order to set in motion production processes for that to occur. It's quite, again, a remarkable result. And then we want to talk about components of the time market. The time market is made up of two major components. There are two ways in which present money could trade for future money. One we call the credit markets, and in credit markets there's a contractual arrangement that's made between the lender and the borrower. And so present money is lent under contract, and then the borrower is, again, under contract, an enforceable contract, to pay back the stipulated funds in the future. And then we can further break down credit markets into consumer loans and producer loans. And then we can further break down consumer loans into the different types, right? Mortgage loans and auto loans and general merchandise loans and so on. And same with producer loans, AAA corporate bonds, junk bonds, and so on and so forth. And then the second part of the time market is the capital structure. And the capital structure is what we've been explaining all along, where entrepreneurs are engaged in production by fronting money to the owners of the factors of production. They pay their workers on an ongoing basis. They buy their materials. Right? The auto company buys the parts and then assembles the car and then sells the car 6 months later. They're lending, paying upfront money, not under contract, but implicitly, with the intention of getting future money back when they sell the product. And that investment commands a rate of interest. One last point about this, producer loans, by the way, all end up in the capital structure. So producer loans are not an independent part of the time market. They have no causal importance in explaining the time market. The time market is explained just by our demand for consumer loans and the entrepreneur's demand for factors of production. And that's it. I point this out because the neoclassical theory of the interest rate is the supply and demand for producer loans. Just that, right? So again, you can see a pretty distinct contrast between the Austrian approach and the approach of the neoclassical school. Now, let's, I'm getting to the end of my time, so let me mention one other aspect of the time market. And this is the arbitrage. We had mentioned arbitrage before. This is the arbitrage that would take place to create uniformity of the pure rate of interest across all loans. So suppose, to the contrary, suppose we had consumer loans here in the left panel, and the interest rate was very low at point A, and we had loans, implicit loans in the production processes that entrepreneurs were making where they were earning very sizable rates of return. Then what would happen, of course, is that the capitalists who supply the funding would shift their supply out of the low interest rate loans, moving back to point B, and into the high interest rate loans again until those interest rates came together. And so we see, even though we don't necessarily see the same interest rates across all loans empirically, we know that the pure rate of interest is actually being equated underneath that, right? We don't, even though we don't see it empirically. So the last thing I'll say then on that point is that this is just another example of the robust explanatory nature of the Austrian approach. What we're really trying to explain is the unseen meaning of action, right? In addition to the empirical features of it, we can explain the actual meaning of it to human persons, whereas again, our neoclassical friends explain only the empirical. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to do that just to show that the person B, if I just put 1,300, 1,000, and 1,000, we couldn't tell what person B would be willing to pay as a borrower to get the 1,000. Right? See, so that's why I know it's a little bit weird, but yeah, but that's the reason. One of them has to be the borrower, so we have to know what would they pay maximum. Yeah. No, we don't. I deny it. I deny that there's any actual non-government interference